Hi, this is Latoya Gale from Neighborhood Villages. Um, just welcome to everybody who logged on tonight. This is our first budget breakdown for the year, and we're going to be starting with Governor Healey's FY27 budget proposal. So, could I have the next slide, please? This is our agenda for tonight. We're gonna just go over the proposal, tell you what it means, and offer you guys some next steps, and always Q&A. So can I have the next slide, please? And we are going to continue with this elevating voices continuum that Strategies has familiarized us with. So can you put in the chat if you what your role is in early education and care field? For number one, you can put if you're the caregiver of a young child, or in your role, you interact with children and families every day. Or put a number two if in your role you interact with children and families occasionally. Or number three, if you do not regularly interact with children and families, but you do have a vested interest. So let's see what's in our chat. We got a good mix of folks, ones, twos, and threes, so that's great. Thank you. And then we wanted to also highlight some common questions that folks have sent in to us when you registered. So, and the first one is, how will federal funding cuts impact the mass budget and EEC funding? What programs are state funded and which are federal? And do we anticipate needing to use any state funding to bolster federal funding? Will there be an increase in daily rates for subsidized care? Are there any proposed increases in funding to address the CCFA waitlist? Will there be any changes to the C3 grant amounts and process in the FY27 budget? And will Mass be able to continue to offer the C3 funds to all programs who qualify? Those are the questions that came to us before today. But if you have any other questions, please feel free to add them to the chat. And we will try to adjust them, okay? And I'm going to pass it off to Emmanuel now or Shakira.
It's to me.
Okay.
So now we're just going to do a brief overview of the state budget process. We're going to talk about what a state budget is and what it does. So the state budget is a statement of values that shows what programs and initiatives are important to the Commonwealth. In this case, we're looking at the governor's budget proposal, which sets the tone for the rest of the budget season and gives us a sense of what she's thinking and prioritizing. The budget also tells us how Massachusetts will spend state revenue and whether there are any parameters for how that money is spent, which we'll talk a bit more about in the next few slides. Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about the timeline. The fiscal year started on July 1st, 2026, and it ends on June 30th, 2027. So as we know, the governor's budget proposal was just released in January. Then the next step in the legislature are the Joint Ways and Means Committee public hearings by topic area. So there'll be one on education where they'll invite a panel from higher ed, K through 12, and early education to talk about budget priorities, usually sometime in March. Then in April, the House releases their budget proposal and the Senate releases theirs in May. In June, we'll have the conference committee where the Senate and House discuss both their budgets and have to come up with a compromise, resulting in a final budget that then goes to the governor. And then you have the final budget in July. In the later slides, we'll revisit the timeline and talk more about when and how to reach out to legislators. So just a little about understanding the budget, where to find the budget documents, and how to understand them. The first link takes you to the governor's budget page. The second link takes you to EEC specific line items in the budget. And so at the same time, the governor released her FY27 budget. She also released an FY26 supplemental budget, which can get kind of confusing. So the supplemental budget is based on extra revenue collected from income surtax. This link tells you where to find it. And you'll have access to these slides afterwards for these links as well. In terms of reading the budget, you want to look for specific line item numbers. Each program, like C3 and CCFA, are represented by specific numbers. Early education and care related line item numbers tend to be represented by 3000s and 1596s, which you'll see once we get into the actual budget. The other important thing to read is the specific line item language, which tells you how and for what purpose the money can be used. Sometimes it's general language, and other times there'll be specific information in it, like earmarks that tell you whether part of the money must go towards a specific program or project. And now I'm going to pass it to Emmanuel for the context for FY27.
Awesome. Thank you, Shakira. Can you go to the next slide, please? I think it's important for us to talk about the context for the fiscal year 2027 budget. So starting with what happened last fiscal year. So in fiscal year 2026, Massachusetts passed the annual state budget on July 4, 2025. Sorry, Massachusetts passed the fiscal year state budget on July 4th, 2025, and that budget will be in effect until June 30th, 2026. And so in that budget, it had sustained funding levels and included additional funding to maintain the Child Care Financial Assistance Program. It also allocated funding for policy reforms that were passed in fiscal year 2025. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So it's important when we're also thinking about the fiscal year 2027 budget that we're thinking about how the federal budget comes into play or federal actions come into play as well. So just like the state has a budget process, the federal government has a budget process, and we depend on them for reimbursement for childcare, transportation, education, public health, housing, and more. And so changes to their budget impact the state. And to put that a little bit more into context, so Governor Healey's budget is $63 billion, and that
Emmanuel, can we slow it down a little
Oh,
bit? Sorry.
sorry. Um, to put that into context, Governor Healey's budget is $63 billion, and it relies on the federal government for about $15 billion, which is 25% of the budget. Also, the Healey administration has shared that recent cuts and policy changes from the federal government have limited resources to state government and local partners, putting core programs at risk. Additionally, state revenue projections show that the state is in a period of slow growth, so it is a challenging budget year. All right, so for the federal government, it is currently closing out its fiscal year 2026 budget process, and then it will turn to the same process for fiscal year 2027. The federal government recently passed several budget bills for the fiscal year 2020, for the rest of the fiscal year 2026, that funds most agencies. They are currently negotiating funding for the Department of Homeland Security. One of the budget bills it passed includes a level funding or increased funding for key early education programs. So it includes increased funding for Head Start, the Community Services Block Grant, CCDBG, which partially funds CCFA. It also includes funding for the Preschool Development Grant and Child Care Access Means Parents in Schools. All right. A majority of early education funding is state funding. However, generally less than 20% of it is federal funding, which primarily goes to child care financial assistance. If the amount of federal funding the Commonwealth were to receive from the federal government were to decrease significantly, then the state would have some really hard choices that we can't predict or assume at this time. I think last time at the budget breakdown, we talked about the One Big Beautiful Bill that passed last year, and it has serious implications for the Massachusetts budget, children and families, and educators and services, as it has changes to SNAP and Medicaid, or what is also known as Mass Health, like reduced funding and the limiting of immigrant eligibility. These areas don't directly relate to early education and care, but they will impact funding that is available for early education and care. Changes in what we get from the federal government in these areas may create holes in other areas that lead to shifts in funding for early education and care. So this is the landscape that the budget writers are navigating. Additionally, different legislators have different priorities than each other in the government. So ultimately, the bottom line is that we don't have a reliable partner like we have had in the past, and that makes things hard. The last bullet I want to focus on is the child care funding freeze. There have been threats from the federal government regarding funding for subsidies to childcare and other funding that supports vulnerable and low-income families. Earlier this year, the Department of Health and Human Services froze access to federal childcare and certain family assistance funds to 5 states, not Massachusetts, but to 5 other states for concerns about fraud. And the freeze has been paused by a judge for the duration of the lawsuit, but it is concerning for many states. And also the Department of Justice has established a new division for fraud enforcement, and it will investigate childcare and Head Start programs around the country. All right, next slide, please. Okay, the governor's budget and what it means for you. Next slide, please. So the governor passed her budget proposal, and as Shakir said, it kind of like kicks off budget season. And the governor's proposal is $63 billion, which is about a 4% increase from the fiscal year 26 budget, and just under 3% of it goes to early education and care. It makes the governor's budget makes a $1.8 billion investment to the early education sector, which is a $181 million increase from fiscal year 26, or if you're counting the fiscal year 26 budget plus the fiscal year 25 SUP, it is a 136 increase from those. Alongside her budget, as Shakira talked about, the governor filed a fair share supplemental budget proposal that spends $1.15 billion in surplus surtax revenue. $150 million of that goes to the High Quality Early Education and Care Affordability Fund, which is then used to partially fund childcare financial assistance. So this chart shows some of the line items in the budget that relate to early education and care. The budget increases funding to CCFA, CPPI, and the EEC administration line item, and level funds many programs and initiatives like C3, the CRNRs, Head Start, and the CFCEs. Head Start is primarily funded directly from the federal government. So this funding that you're seeing in this chart is supplemental funds that the state provides. So this budget does make some cuts to some line items for early education and care. There are some cuts to the early childhood mental health line item and the health education opportunities line item, or career pathways line item, and funding for the 2024 reforms that we'll talk about in the next slide. Also, like I said, these are just some of the line items. If you want to know about all of them, further down in our slide deck, which we're going to send to you, there is a link to Neighborhood Villages brief that we put out regarding the governor's proposal, and it has an appendix that has all of the line items for early education and care. so you can take a look at them. But just to recap, C3 level funded at $465 million. Child care financial assistance is funded at 1.22 billion, which is up $133 million. CPPI is funded at 31.9 million, which is up $11.45 million. And then the EEC administration line item is up $1.6 million. And then for the cuts, early childhood mental health supports is down by about $50,000, and the higher education opportunities or career pathways is down by $30,000. Okay, next slide, please. All right. So one thing I will mention about the CCFA line item is that the governor's proposal in 2026 had like 4 line items for CCFA. In this proposal, there are 2 line items for CCFA, so she kind of conflates them, and it incorporates, DTA, the Department of Transitional Assistance funding for CCA, the Department of Child and Families funding for CCA, also income eligible funding for CCA, and then the rate increases for CCFA for prior rate increases. What it doesn't include is a specific line item for the income eligible wait list. All right. So in the fiscal year 2025 budget, there were a variety of reforms that were made law, different reforms that the advocates have been seeking for years. And so this slide talks about the reforms that have specific monetary allocations attributed to them. So as we know, in the 2025 fiscal year budget, CCFA was made permanent. And so the funding that has been allocated to it is $475 million for CCFA. Eligibility was increased to families making up to 85% of the state median income. And then for scholarships for early educators, that was put into law with updated parameters. Unfortunately, funding in this proposal has not been allocated. So that's a $5 million decrease. And then similarly for the loan forgiveness for early educators, that was created in the budget. And so in this proposal, it has not been allocated funding. So that's a $7.5 million decrease from the fiscal year 2025 supplemental budget. I think we have some questions. Okay.
There's a couple questions in the chat. So Emmanuel, can you just repeat quickly the difference between the fiscal year 2027 state budget proposal, which all of these line items that you're going through are included in that proposal, and then how the governor used the supplemental budget surtax funds? Can you just clarify that sort of difference?
Sure. Sorry. Can you repeat that question for me?
I can honestly take this one.
Okay.
So all of the line items that Emmanuel is going through right now are all included in the FY27 state budget proposal. The governor also filed a surplus surtax supplemental budget on the same day, so it's a separate document meant to allocate, additional funding that they collected through the surplus surtax, and in that included $150 million investment in early education and care, which was deposited into a trust fund for early education and care. That trust fund was then used to fund some of these line items in the FY27 budget. So that's how the two are related. But yes, everything that Emmanuel has been going through here is related to the FY27 state budget proposal. And then there was a quick question about a 20 million. So I'm not sure if let me scroll up real quickly. The 20 million in the state budget is the same from 2025. So the Head Start state supplemental grant actually got an increase last year. So if that is the 20 million you're referring to, No, that was different in 2025. It was increased last year. But both of these figures are the same for last fiscal year's budget for CCR&Rs and the Head Start state supplemental. All right, we have two questions here. So, Manuel, maybe you can take one of these. Does the Massachusetts fiscal year being offset from the federal fiscal year create any gaps in funding or risks in terms of the percentage that Massachusetts gets from the federal budget, or not really? Is that taken into account in terms of access to funds? It's a great question.
This is a great question, and it's something I've been thinking about as of late. I think that definitely them being on different dates complicates things. Um, I- so potentially it could have some impacts. I know that the state budget is usually late. The federal budget is also usually late, so that also complicates things. It would be more helpful if they were a little bit staggered and so that we could have the federal budget to develop the state budget. I think that we have seen this year and last year that, if this federal budget isn't put into place, there are shutdowns. But also, we've heard from the early education EEC that, how it works for CCFA anyways, is that the state uses the state funds first and then they seek reimbursement. And so I think in a way, we're kind of okay. In a way, it's hard to distinguish.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And so, Julie, like as an example, when there was a federal shutdown earlier this year, when they were negotiating the first round of the federal funding, Massachusetts, the commissioner from the Department of Early Education and Care kind of came out and was able to explain that because of the way that we spend federal funding, we kind of, like Emmanuel said, we use the state funds first and then seek reimbursement down the line. So unless that federal shutdown were to last for like almost an entire year, it wouldn't really have an impact on childcare.
Right. I'll add
Funding.
this too. It kind of seems like it might have been implied in the question. All the things that Marissa and Emmanuel said are true. The do we know if the governor or the legislature will be more conservative in what they budget because of the political climate with the federal government? And typically in the past, we knew that you could count on that money coming from the federal government, even if it was late, even if whatever drama was going on, you could count on that. You knew it was going to show up. But I mean, in all honesty, it might play a part in how conservative they are being when they're deciding on their budget numbers as they're putting out a budget now because we're not sure how much we can count on the federal government right now.
Yeah, it's a great point too. So there was a quick question about CPPI, which is the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative, which I can just give a very brief recap of. It's a grant program that essentially encourages local school districts to partner with early education and care programs in their district. So family child care and center-based programs that are in the district around preschool expansion. So the grant goes out to a district and then the district contracts with a family child care program or a center-based program to help support them. So that's like a very simplified overview of what CPPI does. Are there funds in the budget set aside for research and evaluation for early childhood programs? This is a question from Kate. Um, I can, I know that they're typically the administration line item for the EEC administration that you can see there has been used in the past to fund research and evaluation. So I'm curious if I'm not sure if anyone else on the team has any other intel on that, but I'm sure that the governor's proposal includes some form of research and evaluation in there, as well as, I mean, we know that the Department of Early Education and Care's staff has really increased in previous years in terms of research and evaluation, and they've increased their capacity significantly. So we know that the governor's proposal for that line item would maintain, program operations at EEC and sort of their capacity there. But Manuel, is there anything else you can think of that?
There's nothing else that I can think of. That's what I was thinking too as well about the EEC administration line item.
And then, all right, so we should get into, I think we'll get into the meaningful projections about what the additional 133 million means on your next slide, Emmanuel. So we can maybe save that for the next slide. I think that's all right. I think we got through all the questions. Whoops. This one or one back?
This one. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll pass it to you, Latoya.
Hi, I'm back. And so on these slides, we call these slides real talk. Um, so, you know, there's a bunch of numbers, there's a bunch of line items, but like what are the real life implications of those things? Um, for the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative, it's
Oh, my bad.
it's all right. That's all right. Um, it's up. There we go. It's all right. We'll
There you
we'll
go.
get it. We'll get it together. Don't worry. It's up $11.45 million, right? So this line also includes 5 million from the summer step up program. The CPPI, all the acronyms, guys, was funded at 24 million in FY26 by supplementing the line item using fair share surplus and other available funds. And so this increase would move planning grantees into implementation and be able to welcome new communities. As far as the reimbursement rate goes, we see there's nothing on the line item from the governor, so that's down 20 million. And so reimbursement rates remain below the cost of care, and that limits financial well-being of providers and also the willingness of providers to participate in CCFA. For higher education, it's down $30,000. That's, minuscule. I would even dare to say it's almost level funded. But career pathways was funded at 7.5 million in FY26 by again supplementing using fair share dollars. And we do have another slide that we're talking about CCFA. I don't know if it's back one. Maybe we skipped
I
over
think
it.
I went one past.
Okay.
Yeah, this one.
Okay. Yeah, it's okay.
Go for
it. There you go. And so C3 grants, again, guys, level funded. But the reality is we know the cost of care has gone up and provider participation has also increased, but the funding has remained flat. And so again, we'll be a broken record, but it's important to still advocate that more funding is needed to continue to do the same work at the current capacity and to cover new providers who are eligible to participate. The same is true for CCFA. It's up 133 million, which is a big increase, but that 133 million has to go to pay for current capacity and also anticipated growth with DTA and DCF caseload, and to annualize the provider reimbursement rates. And it will not, unfortunately, increase access for income eligible families. So, and then for CCR&Rs, it's also remained flat. We've heard from the folks who run the CCR&Rs, their caseloads keep going up. And so, an increase in funding is actually needed to support that caseload. And I don't know if we have any more questions. Thank you guys for all the questions in the chat as well.
Yeah, these are some great questions. I'm
Yeah.
trying to answer them in the chat as
Yeah,
well
yeah, yeah. No, it's perfect.
as
It's
live,
perfect.
but so Suzanne, I think we got to yours there. CCFA,
Yeah.
essentially 133 million would maintain the existing sort of status quo for childcare financial assistance. The children that receive childcare access to CCFA through the Department of Transitional Assistance or the Department of Children and Families, it's considered an entitlement. So the legislature is sort of obligated to fund those regardless of funding levels, so that they have to kind of plan for the anticipated growth in that caseload over the next year. They have to annualize the reimbursement rate, and then there's a couple sort of continuity of care scenarios as well, but
Right.
in general, it would kind of remain the same.
Yep.
So there is one question around the trust fund. So I believe the entirety of the 150 million was used in the FY27 budget. So that would leave nothing in the trust fund moving forward. At the same time, I do think it's a really good point, because yes, I mean there is an ability for funds that are deposited into legislative trust funds to grow over time. So it's something to think about in future years if we see any other additional funds deposited into the trust fund.
Mhm. All right. And Shakira, are you up next?
I think so.
Okay.
Yep, developing your budget ask. So after talking about what was in the governor's budget, now we're going to talk about budget advocacy and what you can do between now and the final budget. So what are we still fighting for? In thinking about developing your budget ask, you want to think about what it is that you're still fighting for, such as increased funding for income eligible seats to get more children off the wait list for CCFA, increased funding for C3, which Latoya just talked about being level funded, increased funding for reimbursement rates for FY27, which we know was not included in the governor's proposal, or educator compensation and career advancement. Next slide. So in thinking about identifying your budget priorities, and we just talked about what, is still needed, what was missing in the governor's budget, you also want to think about how these will impact you and what's most important for you to prioritize so that you can begin thinking about how to advocate and what story or message you want to share. Next slide. Which brings us back to when should you advocate? So right now the House is discussing and putting together their budget proposal. And this is where it's important to know who your representatives are so that you can reach out to them to begin sharing your stories and sharing your budget priorities. We'll share a link in the chat that can help you find your representative if you don't already know who they are. And then as you're reaching out to your state representatives, you can also be reaching out to the senators, especially as after the House releases their budget in April, the Senate will release theirs in May. So you want to make sure you're reaching out to both your state representatives and your state senators. And then similarly, before the House and Senate come together to vote, you can contact the conference committee. Think about whether there are things in the House and Senate budget proposals that were aligned with your budget priorities that you want to see make it to the final budget, and then let them know what those are. Next slide. And so just talking about building relationships with your elected officials, which I kind of just mentioned, contacting them, but you want to make sure you're contacting them early and often. I think we mentioned last time in budget breakdown, you don't want the first time you're contacting them to be when you're making a ask. You want to make sure that you are building that relationship. Maybe there's someone in the legislature who is passionate about a specific issue area that can become a legislative champion for one of your priorities. So just thinking about who those people are and like how you can be reaching out to them, whether that's emails or visiting the State House. And so I'm going to pass it back to Marissa, who's going to talk about how to take action and share your budget ask.
So I think the questions that you all have had in the chat, and there's a couple more that I want to get to in a second. What we really wanted to share with you all tonight is not only what was included in the governor's FY27 state budget proposal and tools like this about how to build relationships with your elected officials. I'm glad that you all are liking the real talk. I'm going to give Latoya credit on that one because I think that is a really helpful way to talk about these numbers that can seem huge and be really confusing, honestly. But it helps to be able to understand what that means. So the last thing that we wanted to end with today is sort of where to go from here. How do you advocate for the state budget? What do you feel comfortable with? How can we support you? How can we give you resources, information, and a sense of what other organizations are asking for so that you can decide what makes the most sense for you. So before I get into any of that, we have a question from Maria about opportunities to provide support to new educators to keep their doors open. So when we're talking about C3, I'm going to go back. We know how important C3 has been to all early education and care programs in Massachusetts. So as Latoya was talking about, when it's level funded, that's difficult because costs have gone up. And so if you're currently receiving C3 and your costs have gone up, those dollars don't go as far as they used to. So we have a reason to ask for additional funding for that reason. We also know that there are approximately 600 new early education and care programs that have opened recently that have been unable to access C3 dollars because of the insufficient funding or the level funding. So one of the things that we're thinking about, and then I'll reference in a minute, is if we were to get an increase to C3, that would allow the Department of Early Education and Care to open up the grant to new programs, to those 600 new programs, and it would prevent them from having to make any difficult choices between, whether they should open it up to new programs or whether they're going to have to change funding amounts for existing programs, which we don't want to see happen. So just want to flag that piece. And then Dulce, I think your question was around C3 as well. So right now it is level funded. If it were to, at the end of this budget process in July, if it were to stay level funded, that's where it would go to implementation then. So we'd have to have conversations with the Department of Early Education and Care around what that funding could do. Are they going to keep everyone's grant amounts the same? That would be my prediction, that they would sort of maintain the status quo of what you all have now, rather than reopening it to new early education and care programs, opening them up to the C3 grant, which is a difficult choice that we don't want to see them have to make. All right, so let's talk about developing an ask. So Strategies for Children over the past few years has sent out an email alert to everyone that signs up for our email. So Neri, can you go ahead and put the Strategies email sign up in the chat just so everyone has it? So what we'll do is we'll send this email that gives you, a quick summary of what was included in the governor's budget or in the House budget or the Senate budget, depending on what stage of the process we're in. And then it says, you can see, click here to email your state representative today. So when you click on that link, it brings you to the form that's on the right-hand side of the screen here, which essentially just asks you to plug in your information, so your name, your email, and your address. And then it uses your address to automatically sort through the Massachusetts State Legislature and automatically email your state representative and your state senator. And what we have done here is, you can see at the very bottom, I know it's small font, but there's a template there where it says, please support the following line items this is from last year, the FY26 state budget, and it goes through various line items. So the good thing about that is that if you want to reach out to your legislator, but you're not quite sure what you would want to say or what you would want to advocate for, this gives you a starting place. You can go through and you can edit, you can take out anything that you don't agree with or that you don't want to advocate for. You can add something to it. But it gives you, it gives you a sense of what other organizations are asking for and a place to start, really. So you can expect this email from us in the next, I'd say, week. And what we're going to start with is just asking you all to reach out to your legislators, so your state senator and your state representative, and share with them what the early education and care ask is. Later on in the year, we'll target specific legislators. So we'll send an email and it'll just go to the House Ways and Means Committee, as an example, who's going to be setting the budget in the House. So that's the first thing to look out for. And then after the House Ways and Means Committee, we're going to have you all kind of send that large email to all of the legislators in the State House again. So we'll give you another chance to reach out to them to make sure that all of your legislators are hearing about early education and care priorities, and that when they go to have conversations with the Ways and Means Committee or with the Senate President, the Speaker of the House, the sort of leadership on either side of the legislature, that they're able to say, you know, one of my top 3 priorities is X, Y, or Z for early education and care. I'm hearing from my constituents, the people who live in my district, that this is really important to them. That's what our goal is with those contact your legislators. And then we'll switch over to the Senate. So we'll have, you know, we'll send out another email, give you the chance to kind of click to email the Senate Ways and Means Committee and send them, again, the early education and care ask. The kind of goal here is repetition and making sure that they're hearing from all of us over and over and over again over the next few months as they are developing and then finalizing their state budget. So some example budget asks. So Suzanne, back to your question. The 133 million that was included in the governor's budget really level funds programs and services for childcare financial assistance. So we wouldn't see an opening or an increase in access for income eligible families. And we know that that has been essentially frozen for the past few years and has been really difficult for both families and for programs. So strategies and a number of other organizations are going to be asking for a $31.2 million increase above the governor's levels. So 164 million in total. But that would allow us to provide an increase in access to childcare financial assistance for around 2,000 families, children. We're also going to be asking for $30 million to increase the reimbursement rates for early education and care. As Latoya mentioned and Emmanuel mentioned, that was not included in the governor's budget. And then finally, for actually, you know, I think the first year, a lot of organizations are going to be asking for an increase to the Commonwealth Cares for Children C3 grant program, increasing it to 510 million from 475. Going back to what you all were talking about earlier, to allow us to open up access to the new early education and care programs that have opened in the state. This is meant to be a grant that is open to all early education and care licensed programs, and we want to make sure that it stays that way. And then depending on if there's any funding left, to allow for potential increases to programs as well. And then at the bottom of the screen here, you can see that we have a number of other early education and care line items that, you know, we're looking at and that have developed an ask. So I've linked to them there, and when you have the slides, you'll be able to follow that link, and then that will also be included in the email blast that we send out in the near future. So you can see a number of what those other kind of recommendations
Please
are.
go.
Yeah, I'll slow down. All right. So then next steps. The next steps is really that contact your legislators email. So keep a lookout for that. Get ready to contact the House Ways and Means in the next month or so. And then as Shakira mentioned, we have both the House and the Senate are going to hold public hearings for the Ways and Means committees. In March, they're going to ask to hear from a few panelists and the Commissioner and new Secretary of Education. So keep a lookout for that. And then sign up for both the 9:30 call and the strategies email, as well as for Neighborhood Villages Policy Pulse. And I know we're going to put in some other links in the follow-up as well that Emmanuel mentioned around the Neighborhood Villages' resources surrounding the FY27 state budget and summarizing the different line items. We also have a couple other resources here from the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, who have done a really good job helping us all kind of understand the state budget process and early education and care line items. You can find those linked there. And then we mentioned the budget briefs from Neighborhood Villages. The last piece that I'll point out is Strategies for Children has a advocacy headquarters toolkit page where we're going to post resources like, how to contact your legislator, the ask sheet that I was just talking about, where it has the different line items and what we're all asking for. That will be saved there, as well as the email and sort of like click to contact your legislator will be linked there as well. And then finally, some save the dates. So Joint Ways and Means Committee hearing, that hasn't been announced yet. So as soon as it is, I'm sure we'll share it out with you all. And then it's crazy to say this, but our next budget breakdown isn't until May 7th. So this will be after the House releases their budget, and we'll go through what's included in that and look towards the Senate. So between now and then, the main thing is really just making sure that as many legislators as possible are hearing about what is needed for early education and care and that they're hearing from you all. So I'm going to take down the slides and we have a few minutes left and I would love to just hear from you all. I know there's probably some questions in the chat too that we can go through in the last few minutes.
Yeah, I wanted to uplift Edna's question. Edna, you can come off mute too, but are you asking if the $510 million ask will open up C3 for new providers?
I'm sorry, you were asking a question or?
Yeah, I was asking if that's what you were asking with your question. If the $510
Yeah.
million ask that the field is asking for, if that will open up C3 to new providers?
My understanding is that right now there's not allowed. Sorry, I can hear the translation. Yeah. So my question is, I'm wondering if the C3 grant for new providers are included in the budget. It doesn't appear to be. That's why I'm wondering. I was wondering also about the advocacy for new educators too.
Yeah, that's a good question, Edna. So yes, the governor's
Okay.
the governor's budget was level funded, so there's not any additional funding for the new programs to access C3 in that proposal. The commissioner of the Department of Early Education and Care shared it, I think, last month's board meeting, that the cost to fund those new programs would be around 500 million. So we are expecting that, C3 grants would have to increase to above that to be able to open up to new programs. And then, yes, Julie, share it all. This is all meant to be shared with as many people as possible. And I mean, these meetings are open to anyone too. So if anyone wants to come join the next one too, we'll also have the recordings up on our YouTube channel, so you can see that as well there. And then, like I mentioned, we share a lot of the stuff on the advocacy headquarters page too. So feel free to add that. In the next week or so, I think a lot of this stuff will start to come out, and you'll see emails from us that you can forward to anyone in your network. Suzanne, hello.
Hi, I see some wonderful familiar faces here. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for doing this. This is so, so helpful. I've been in this realm for like a few years now, and it still feels so mysterious and labyrinthine. So thank you for putting this together. It's really helpful. I'm going to try and be succinct in a question about a very specific thing. In the place where C3 amounts in their tiered disbursement based on the percentage of voucher receiving children in your program intersects with that CCFA funding. Just from the ground, my family child care right now, has a child enrolled full-time who's been on the wait list since she was 2.5 years old. She's about to leave for kindergarten on the fall. She's not coming off. And we're not going to kick them out and enroll a voucher receiving child to get more C3. Are there conversations happening anywhere you know about expanding that tier to include in the percentage of C3 calculation children who are qualified for vouchers and are on the wait list versus kids who are already receiving them? Because if not, that's where I really want to push. But if it's already happening, I want to get behind the work that's already happening.
That is such a good question. I think there's a couple things I want to point out. So one, I think that's actually really important for your legislators and everyone's legislators to hear, to understand how important access to childcare financial assistance is and how closely tied that is to C3 funding. Because I'm not sure that they fully understand that dynamic. And on the program side, I mean, your story is not unique there. That is happening to many programs right now. So that's important to, in your budget advocacy, to bring things like that up. The Department of Early Education and Care has talked about how starting in the late spring, early summer, they want to look at the C3 formula again and consider revisions. So I think that's really the place where what you're talking about, where that conversation should happen and needs to happen, as we're thinking through like how we want to, honestly, like C3 is still relatively new and it has been the funding formula and the decisions we've made up until this point have been based on what was the original federal allotment that Massachusetts received. I think it'd be really great if this summer we kind of took a pause and looked forward and said, like, well, what do we want this to be long term? And how does it work? And what should the tiering be? All of those pieces. So, yes, I think it's on a lot of people's radars, and it probably makes sense in that, the conversation makes sense in that setting because um, currently there is legislative language around the tiering, which I think complicates changing because then you have to go back and you have to see that legislative language come out of statute or new language get passed. So I think it'd be helpful to kind of shift this process over and start having it at the Department of Early Education and Care, just so that as the years go on, we can all continue to make it better and iterate and change things. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right. I see question in the chat about when will voucher funds going to be unfrozen? How long is C3 going to last? Ooh, big questions. So in terms of the voucher funds going to be unfrozen, the governor's proposal for vouchers would not result in any, increases in access for income eligible families. The additional $31.2 million that we're asking for from the legislature above those levels would result in an additional 2,000 families coming off the wait list. So if we can get that passed and included in the state budget, that would mean new voucher funds for families after the budget's finalized. And then in terms of C3, so so C3 was made, Emmanuel got it. C3 was made permanent in the FY 2025 state budget, which means that that grant is not going anywhere. What we have to do is just make sure that the funding levels continue to grow and that they allow us to continue to invest in you all and your programs and early educator salaries, which are some of the biggest priorities for the grant. All right. Is there anything else in the chat that I've missed so far?
There's one last question. Does Massachusetts have anything available on CCFA waitlist? Are there any priority or eligibility groups still able to access care?
Yes. So we can send you, okay, let me actually pull this up. The Department of Early Education and Care, like I mentioned, actually has really increased their capacity in terms of data and evaluation, and they created a data dashboard recently, which has sort of a real-time monthly update on the wait list, on the number of children that are receiving vouchers. So I'm going to put that in the chat right now just so that you can see that piece of it. And then, so in terms of priority, there's children that receive access to childcare financial assistance based on their income eligibility. That has been largely frozen over the past almost 2 years. The only exception to that is that there are some, it's called continuity of care cases, where if your sibling is in care already, then the siblings receive access. And there's one other scenario last year when the contracts were reprocured and then some of those children moved over into a voucher. So those children have still been able to get access. And then the other piece is what I mentioned around children that receive access through their involvement with the Department of Transitional Assistance or the Department of Children and Families. And that is considered an entitlement. So the legislature is obligated to fund that every year. So they are also still receiving access. And actually, I think partially because the Department of Early Education and Care has made it easier to do business with it, with vouchers and with the CCFA system, that the number of children that are getting access that way has increased. All right. I think we are at 7:30. If you have any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we can follow up in our email afterwards. I'm sure we'll be sending a bunch of resources. Thank you all so much for being here tonight and for all these really great questions. And then, yeah, look out for opportunities to advocate, get in contact with your legislators. I think that between now and May, the more people they can hear from, the better chance that we have of getting some of these goals kind of over the finish line and seeing them in the state budget. Awesome. All right. Have a great night, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and big thank you to Excel.
Yes, thank you, Excel,
Thank you, Camilla.
all of our interpreters tonight.
Always a pleasure. Bye bye. Have a great night.